The Wehrmacht smashed through the Ardennes forest on 10th of May 1940, and within a fortnight, the entire Allied defensive strategy lay in ruins. What military planners in Paris and London had spent months constructing, the careful positioning of the British Expeditionary Force, the coordination with French armies, the assumption that the Maginot Line would hold, all of it collapsed in a matter of days. German panzer divisions didn't just breach the front, they raced through gaps so quickly that Allied commanders were reading battlefield reports that were already 12 hours out of date. By 20th May, German armoured columns had reached the Channel coast at Abbeville, effectively cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and 3 French armies from the rest of France. 300,000 British and French troops found themselves trapped in an ever-shrinking pocket around the port of Dunkirk. The military term for their situation was encircled. The blunt reality was that Britain's entire professional army, the core of its military strength, was about to be captured or annihilated. Wehrmacht generals were already discussing which units would march in the victory parade through London. The question wasn't whether Britain could be defeated, but how quickly they'd accept the inevitable. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel examined reports of the Dunkirk pocket and told colleagues that the British situation was hopeless in a military sense. He wasn't engaging in propaganda, he was reading topographical maps and counting divisions. Operation Dynamo, the emergency evacuation from Dunkirk, began on 26th of May 1940. What unfolded over the next 9 days became one of history's most remarkable retreats, though calling it a victory required extraordinary spin. Yes, 338,826 men made it off those beaches, but they left behind virtually all their heavy equipment, 600 tanks, 2,500 artillery pieces, 64,000 vehicles, and mountains of ammunition and supplies. Britain had saved its men but lost its army's teeth. Churchill himself told the War Cabinet on 28th of May that Britain now possessed perhaps a dozen properly equipped divisions to defend the entire island against an invasion force that had just torn through the supposedly impregnable French defences. The Royal Navy remained formidable, and the RAF was intact. But if German boots hit British soil in force, there was precious little standing between them and Whitehall. The French situation deteriorated even faster. Paris fell on 14th of June 1940. By 22nd June, Marshal Pétain was signing an armistice in the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler's deliberate theatre of revenge. Britain now stood entirely alone. Every other Western European democracy had either fallen or remained neutral. The Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Hitler. America sat across the Atlantic, firmly isolationist. In Berlin, the mood was almost celebratory. Hitler's architect Albert Speer later recalled the Führer poring over architectural plans for remodeling Berlin into the world capital Germania, convinced the war in the West was essentially finished. German military intelligence assessed that Britain, deprived of continental allies and facing the full weight of Wehrmacht, would seek terms within weeks. It wasn't arrogance. From a purely military standpoint, their analysis seemed sound. The Luftwaffe had proven itself unstoppable in Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. Its commanders believed one sustained bombing campaign against British ports and airfields would demonstrate to London's leadership that continued resistance meant nothing but destruction without purpose. Surely Churchill, however bombastic his rhetoric, would eventually bow to mathematics. They were about to discover that mathematics doesn't account for everything. Hitler's expectation of British surrender wasn't wishful thinking. It was based on what he considered a rational assessment of Britain's options. On 2nd July 1940, he issued a directive to his commanders preparing for the possibility of an invasion, but the document's language revealed his true belief. He expected Britain to see reason, before such measures became necessary. The Führer had watched other European leaders choose pragmatism over destruction, and he saw no reason why the British would be different. His track record supported this confidence. Austria's Kurt Schuschnigg had capitulated without a shot in March 1938. Czechoslovakia's Emil Hácha had signed his country away after a single night of intimidation. Poland fought, but even that campaign ended in weeks. In Hitler's mind, leaders, when confronted with overwhelming force, made rational calculations about national survival. Churchill, he reasoned, would eventually perform the same arithmetic. The terms Hitler envisioned offering Britain were, by his standards, generous. Germany would dominate the continent, Britain would keep its empire and navy. The Reich wanted continental hegemony, not British colonies in Africa and Asia. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop had actually laid out these parameters in private discussions, suggesting that Britain could remain a global power if it simply accepted German supremacy in Europe. From Berlin's perspective, this seemed almost magnanimous. Britain would lose nothing it currently possessed overseas, merely acknowledge the new European reality. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel told interrogators after the war that Hitler genuinely admired the British Empire and had no desire to dismantle it. The Führer saw Britain and Germany as natural allies against Bolshevism. His book, Mein Kampf, despite its many hatreds, expressed respect for British imperial administration. Hitler believed he was offering Churchill a face-saving exit. Stop fighting over Poland, already defeated, and keep everything else that matters to you. German military intelligence reinforced this expectation. Their reports suggested that Churchill represented a war party that was growing more isolated daily. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, intercepted communications indicating substantial British elite support for negotiations. These weren't fabrications. There genuinely were voices in London's corridors of power advocating precisely what Hitler expected. The intelligence wasn't wrong. The conclusion drawn from it was. General Franz Halder, the Wehrmacht's Chief of General Staff, wrote in his diary on 13th of July that Britain's military situation was hopeless, and that Churchill's government would likely fall once the British public grasped the full extent of their predicament. Halder was no fool. He'd orchestrated the stunning victory in France. His assessment that Britain couldn't win militarily was accurate. What he missed was that not winning and not surrendering aren't the same thing. Hitler kept delaying the formal planning for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, because he was waiting for London to initiate contact about terms. He told General Alfred Jodl in mid-June that he didn't want to humiliate Britain unnecessarily, as he'd need them as future partners against the Soviet Union. Every day that passed without an invasion being launched was, in Hitler's mind, another opportunity for Churchill to come to his senses. The Luftwaffe's Hermann Göring shared this assessment, but with less patience. He believed a demonstration of air power, hitting military targets, disrupting supply chains, showing Britain's vulnerability, would accelerate the political calculation. Göring wasn't advocating for the terror bombing of civilians at this stage. He was planning what he considered a rational application of military pressure to achieve a political objective. What none of them grasped was that Churchill wasn't playing the same game. They expected a European-style negotiation between rational state actors. Churchill was preparing for something far more elemental. While Hitler was waiting for British reason to prevail, that very reason was being argued for inside Churchill's own war cabinet. Between 26th and 28th of May 1940, right as Dunkirk evacuation ships were dodging Luftwaffe bombs, the most consequential debate in British history was unfolding in the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, wasn't some defeatist or coward. He was an experienced diplomat who'd served as Viceroy of India, and he was making what he considered a coldly logical case. Halifax's proposal was specific. Approach Mussolini as a mediator to explore what terms might be available from Germany. Italy hadn't yet entered the war, and Mussolini still fancied himself a statesman rather than Hitler's junior partner. Halifax argued that if reasonably acceptable terms existed, keeping the fleet, maintaining independence, preserving the empire, rejecting them out of pride would be criminal negligence. Better to discover what was on offer than to fight to total destruction without even knowing if an alternative existed. The Foreign Secretary put it bluntly in the 26th May meeting. We had to face the fact that it was not so much a question of imposing a complete defeat upon Germany, but of safeguarding the independence of our own empire. He wasn't arguing for surrender, he was arguing for diplomatic exploration before the military situation deteriorated further. If Britain waited until after losing its entire army and air force, it would negotiate from an even weaker position. Neville Chamberlain, still in the War Cabinet despite his May resignation as Prime Minister, initially leaned towards Halifax's position. This wasn't appeasement nostalgia. Chamberlain had spent the past year building up Britain's military after Munich's failure, but he'd also seen the Wehrmacht's capabilities up close, and the mathematics troubled him. 3 of the War Cabinet's 5 members were at least open to Halifax's exploration. Churchill faced a genuine constitutional crisis. He'd been Prime Minister for barely 2 weeks. Halifax had deeper Conservative Party roots and broader support amongst the establishment. If Churchill forced a confidence vote on the peace question and lost, Halifax would likely become Prime Minister and Britain's course would shift dramatically. The new Prime Minister wasn't just fighting Hitler, he was fighting his own government. The debate crescendoed on 28th of May. Halifax pressed his case with increasing frustration, arguing that Churchill's refusal to even explore terms was emotional rather than rational. The Foreign Secretary said Britain must be ready to consider decent terms if such were offered to us. Churchill countered that any negotiation process would destroy British morale and that Hitler's terms would reduce Britain to a slave state regardless of the paper promises. Then Churchill did something decisive. He called a meeting of the full outer cabinet, the 25 ministers outside the core war cabinet. In that larger room, he laid out the choice starkly. He told them that nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished. He painted the picture of negotiation itself as a trap. Once you entered talks, you were signalling weakness, and Hitler would tighten the screws until Britain accepted vassalage disguised as peace. The outer cabinet erupted in support. Ministers banged the table, shouted approval, and made clear they'd rather fight. Churchill had bypassed Halifax's careful logic with something more powerful. He'd connected with the emotional truth that compromise with Hitler meant extinction by degrees. When the War Cabinet reconvened, Halifax's proposal was effectively dead. He'd been outmaneuvered politically, and he knew it. Churchill had won the room, but he hadn't yet won the country. That would require something more than a closed-door political victory. It would require him to speak directly to the British people and articulate why fighting mattered more than survival. Churchill rose to address the House of Commons on 4th of June 1940. The day after the last ships limped back from Dunkirk. Everyone in that chamber knew the brutal facts. The evacuation had saved men but abandoned an army's worth of equipment on French beaches. The question hanging in the air was whether the Prime Minister would prepare the nation for capitulation or something else entirely. He began with unflinching honesty about the military disaster. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory, he told the packed chamber. Wars are not won by evacuations. Churchill wasn't interested in sugarcoating Dunkirk. He walked through the numbers, the losses, the equipment left behind. He made Parliament confront the scope of the defeat before he offered them anything resembling hope. Then he shifted. He started building a case not for why Britain could win, but for why Britain must fight regardless. He described the Wehrmacht's capabilities without flinching, their tanks, their aircraft, their proven tactics, and then he laid out, in methodical detail, how Britain would resist invasion. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. Not might defend, shall defend." What came next was a crescendo that every person in that chamber felt in their chest. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills." Each phrase hit like a hammer. No conditional language, no diplomatic hedging, just the blunt promise of endless resistance. Harold Nicholson, a National Labour MP, recorded in his diary that evening that the House was deeply moved, but that many MPs had tears streaming down their faces during the speech. This wasn't theatrical emotion, it was the release of tension that had been building since Dunkirk. Churchill had given them permission to feel what they'd been suppressing. That fighting mattered more than the odds. Then came the line that would echo through history: "We shall never surrender." But Churchill didn't stop there. He added something that revealed his strategic mind. Even if Britain itself were conquered, he declared, the Empire and the fleet would continue the struggle. Until, in God's good time, the new world with all its power and might steps forth to the rescue and liberation of the old. That final clause was deliberate messaging. Churchill was telling America and telling Hitler that this war wouldn't end with Britain's fall. He was threatening infinite resistance, a forever war that would eventually drag in American industrial might. It was a bluff, perhaps, but it was a bluff delivered with such conviction that it sounded like prophecy. The speech's structure was masterful. Churchill had opened by acknowledging disaster, which gave him credibility to then reframe that disaster as the beginning of resistance rather than the end of hope. He'd taken the worst military defeat in modern British history and transformed it into a launching point for defiance. MPs who'd entered the chamber wondering whether negotiation might be sensible left it convinced that surrender was unthinkable. The BBC broadcast portions of the speech that evening. Though Churchill didn't deliver it himself on radio, an actor read excerpts for the broadcast, but the words spread regardless, reprinted in every newspaper, discussed in every pub. Factory workers quoted it. Soldiers repeated it. The speech became the articulation of something the British public had been feeling but couldn't quite express. German intelligence intercepts caught the speech, and translations landed on desks in Berlin within hours. The reaction there was confusion more than concern. Hitler's analysts noted the rhetoric, but dismissed it as the posturing of a leader trying to rally a defeated nation. They still expected reality to set in once the Luftwaffe began its campaign in earnest. They'd fundamentally misunderstood what Churchill had just accomplished. The speech didn't just inspire, it fundamentally altered how millions of Britons processed their situation. Within 48 hours of Churchill's Commons address, Mass Observation, a social research organisation that documented everyday British life,